of early spring, our focus is on what God wants to know. And as a reminder of the texts that we're looking to, we are looking to those texts where instead of our being the ones asking questions of God, God is asking questions of us. This morning we come to one of those immensely important moments in the history of the people of God when Moses is set apart by God for this service of his lifetime. 80 years old. And yet he is just at this point about to embark on the great purpose of his whole life. And we join him in the midst of his encounter with God at the burning bush. Chapter 3 of Exodus gives us the beginning of that story with Moses, the shepherd, out in the wilderness seeing a bush that is burning but not consumed, and the conversation that ensues between him and this voice coming from out of the bush, whom he knows to be the great God. And we get to chapter 4, and now look together at the first verses of that chapter. Then Moses answered, "But suppose they do not believe me or listen to me, but say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.'" The Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" He said, "A staff." And he said, "Throw it on the ground." So he threw the staff on the ground, and it became a snake. And Moses drew back from it. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Reach out your hand and seize it by the tail." So he reached out his hand and grasped it, and it became a staff in his hand, so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. I was thinking back about this passage and remembering one of the moments from my pastoral ministry on the Missouri side, with all apologies, now on the right side of the state line. But we had, at the church, we had what had become a kind of staff break room. And one of the afternoons when the staff had gathered for an afternoon break, a member of the church came rushing in and said, one of the electrical cables next door had fallen and had landed across the shrubbery and had caught the shrubbery on fire. And immediately our church administrator, Joanne Sappington, got up, went to the telephone, picked up, and dialed 111, and as soon as an answer came, said, "I'm calling to report a burning bush." Well, you know, that was a fun moment. It wasn't a happy thing for our neighbors, but the shrubbery was preserved and all was well. A burning bush. Have you had a burning bush experience? Understand that when we really get into this text and understand it not only in terms of Moses' story and its place in the history of Israel, we are also talking about these defining moments when God intersects with us and lays a claim on our life, places us at a crossroads where there's no turning back, and we are invited to consider the improbable, the impossible, and the clear signal that God is inviting us to link our life and our purpose to God's purpose, to be instruments in God's hands. With that in mind, I think it lends itself to some reflections on this moment and God's question and how it might apply to our lives. I was going through some of my mom's things the other day and came across something of mine in the batch. I don't know how it ended up there, but it was a computerized printout from an aptitude test I took in high school. And that was quite a throwback across the years. And based on the answers I gave to hundreds of questions, it pointed me toward particular careers, and it steered me away from some others. It suggested that I might want to consider social work or legal profession. Education was one of them, and ministry, of all things, was one of them. It steered me away from careers as a mechanic or a forest ranger. And I'm grateful to the Cooter test for its insights. Vocation, calling. It's an interesting thing. What's your vocation? The word vocation comes from a Latin word, vocatio, calling. It's a response to an initiation, an initiative from beyond. And its ultimate roots are in a faith perspective, out of the sense that our life purpose is a response, whatever it is, a response to God's initiative, this one who has given us life and breathed the breath of the Spirit of life into us, turning us into animated living beings, so that all of us have a vocation, a reason for being alive. What's yours? Please understand my question. It's important that we understand this, not in terms of what your career is, will be, or was. It's deeper than that. It's not just about how you make a living in terms of putting bread on the table. I'm asking, how is your life taking shape as a response to God's claims on your life? How has God taken the stuff of your life and drawn it into God's redemptive purposes? Because be clear about this. God is wanting us to allow our lives to become a part of the thread work by which God is weaving God's purposes in the midst of our experiences right here in Bonner Springs, and weaving them as a part of the larger purposes of God that are ultimately moving toward God's ultimate destinations with God's ultimate purposes. So however small, seemingly our part, it is a part of that weaving, and we were born for a purpose related to God's purposes. I'm asking each of us to look at our unfolding life in a particular way, and possibly in a new way. Not merely as the marking of time, the effort to prove something or achieve something, the process, the business of survival, the concern of security, a story of accumulating experiences and things, an accident or a happenstance. I'm inviting us to consider that something significantly more important than that is going on for each of us. And this story, this morning's story in the life of Moses, invites us to see our life in this different kind of way, to see it as a God thing, to see it as something God is using and can use even more if we'll consciously place it in God's hands and live responsively as God nudges. With that in mind, we enter into the story and pay attention to what's happening here. What's that in your hand is the important question that God has there. But get just ahead of that experience. Moses is standing in front of a burning bush, interacting with a voice from out of the bush, and God is telling him to go and do something that is huge. Moses suggests that God find someone else. And in fact, it's interesting, if you work your way through chapter 3 of Exodus, you will note that Moses has plenty of questions for God. And in asking his questions, they're all rhetorical questions, which is a way of saying they're questions where Moses has already assumed the answer. And it basically all adds up to this. You who are the voice coming out of this bush, you're crazy. So this question from Yahweh, I am who I am, the great God, interrupts the flow of the conversation. And all of Moses' questions suddenly stop. God's been the one answering the questions. Now God flips things around, takes the lead. What is that in your hand? And don't you know in this moment that Moses does something eminently human? He looks in his hand. He didn't need to do that, did he? He knew exactly what was in his hand, but isn't it human instinct to look over and actually see? And what was it that he sees? He sees the staff. This staff that has become such an important part of his life over 4 decades. It's the staff he has held in his hand that he actually perhaps even made himself. The long, time-smoothed crook that he cut from a tree, bent and rubbed, and that over 40 years has become almost an extension of his body. He's used it to nudge his flock, to scoop them up out of the ravine, to ward off predators. He's used it for balance, to steady his own steps across sometimes rugged terrain. What's that in your hand, is the question. It's a staff, and the staff tells the story of his life. It's the tangible expression of his strengths, for one thing. A man with a particular skill set, capable, resourceful, experienced. It's a token of his stability, his vocation, his way of life for 40 years. It's a symbol of his age, an instrument he now leans on to steady his 80-year-old feet and legs. It's even a reminder of his life-disrupting sin. Do you note that? That staff, if he ponders it very long, is a staff that reminds him how it is he ended up in the wilderness in the first place. How did he end up there? This one who was born under a sentence of death from the Pharaoh, placed in a basket by his mom, discovered by the Pharaoh's daughter, drawn into the household of the Pharaoh, and in the historic irony of all ironies, this one born under a death sentence grows up in the lap of luxury and power and with the best education that that world knew in that day. This one who robed in splendor as a young man, still because he had his mom's influence there in the courts of the Pharaoh, knew his origins and had a sense of justice for his people and could not bear to watch them suffer under the increasingly brutal treatment of Egyptian power of that day. And finally takes matters into his own hands. And when no one's looking, takes one of those guards who has been beating a Jewish or an Israelite man, kills him. And the very next day, one of his own people calls his hands at it, dismisses him, and he goes running because he realizes he's been discovered and he can't count on the protection of his own people. He is in the wilderness, now 40 years later, and he knows that the whole wilderness experience began because he couldn't control his temper. Even his sin is a part of the story that he holds in his hand, the staff. Now, what happens next is very interesting, isn't it? The progression of what occurs is worth a closer look because there's something in it for all of us. This isn't just Moses' defining moment with God, it's ours as well. Take a look at what's in your hand. It's not a staff this morning, but we get to ponder the stuff that makes us who we are. It's the strengths, the capabilities, the unique characteristics that God has gifted us with. These abilities, these interests, these aptitudes that steer us in particular ways, that lead us to develop these nascent skills. So, some of us even take it on to education and into the practices of our lives. They turn us into teachers and doctors and any other number of careers. They're a part of what allow us to effectively navigate the challenges of life on a daily basis. What's in your hand? What is it you claim, you own, as the reality of who you've been made to be? God asks the question, what is it? And then the next, throw it down. Throw it down. Let it go. Open the palm of your hands and release the stuff that makes you who you are, that gives you a deeper sense of your identity even. And hold it out. Turn those hands upside down. Let it drop. How does that feel? You know, it's a frightening prospect, isn't it? I am 63 years old as I stand in this pulpit today. And I have a long track record with my skills and my capabilities for all that they've allowed to happen and all the limitations they impose upon my life. It's all of those. But clearly they make me who I am. And without them, I will confess, without those things, I'd be scratching my head and feeling the palpitation of the heart to say, who am I if not this? Who am I if I don't have these things to hold on to give me an identity, to give me a purpose, to give me the sense of who I am and why I exist? Turn it over, let it go. It's a frightening prospect. And yet that's exactly what God has Moses do. To yield it up, to set it aside. If God actually asked you to give up these things, could you do it? If you had this moment that Moses was facing, could you pull it off? Kiss it goodbye? No assurance of what would come next? How God would provide? How you will survive? What's in your hand? A pen? The keyboard of a computer? Chalk? Tools? Machinery? Baseball? Musical instrument? A remote control device? A steering wheel? There are any number of things we hold in our hands that symbolize the things that give us purpose and value and meaning. And underlying all of this is a deep question. Are you willing to opt for trust over security? Can you trust God rather than cling to your control over life? The ways you secure your existence. It's an honest moment thrust upon us in this space where God confronts us. It feels good to have something in the hand, something to use that makes things happen. A shepherd used a crook for his sheep, to lift them up when they fell into the ditch, to get them back in line, to ward off predatory animals, to protect himself, to give him support and stability. God asks Moses to throw it down, asks him to make himself defenseless, to give up the symbol of his control. And including this, are you willing to let go of your past, your sin? Are you ready to put it behind you? You know, make no mistake about it. That staff symbolized Moses' sin, as we've established. That staff was the reminder of what had been in his hands until he let it slip out of his fingers during a blinding rage. And I hope I'm not the only one here this morning who, in the honesty of my heart, has to admit that there are things from my past that if I let them, can haunt me. Traipse around the inner recesses of my life and whisper in my ears reminders, opportunities lost, doors closed, mistakes impossible to undo. It's the history that each of us has by the mere fact that we've lasted this long. Because every single one of us has mistakes that are there in the archives. The Apostle Paul puts it this way: all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. There is not a single one of us who gets off scot-free. We do not have to parade our sins this morning. No one's asking us to shout out loud what we've done wrong. But we know what they are. And I dare say there are some this morning still haunted. And there's good news. You don't have to be haunted. When God says put it down, he means this too. Your history, those things you can't undo, the unchangeable past, it's in the books. Put it down. I have a friend, bright, gifted guy, respected in ministry, doing what he loved, who had an issue with money and made some questionable choices related to the congregation's funds and was found out before he could make things right. He lost his path. He's no longer a pastor. He's selling cars in what seems like a cliche. And there are wistful moments where he looks back at those gifts that were given him, those opportunities opened up to him, and he confesses that he knows he blew it in terms of that path. And yet he has also, I must say, found another way. And it's the possibility for us as well. And in fact, that's where the next piece of Moses' story comes up. Because what does Moses hear from God next? He's dropped the staff. It falls to the ground. As soon as it does, it is morphed into a snake that slithers about, a poisonous, venomous snake. And then God asks him to pick that up. We have to realize that these strengths and abilities, capacities, these things we look to and call on a daily basis that shape and form who we sense ourselves to be, they are powerfully positive things in our lives. But isn't it not also true that they can be dangerous? If we cling to them, if we presume upon them, if we act like they're ours somehow, that we have a right to them, isn't it possible that they can be twisted and turned so that rather than holding them and using them to God's glory, we use them for our own purposes and our own ends to secure our sense of self, our sense of pride, our sense of security? And they can be, when we throw them down, suddenly be seen for what they are. Not just powerfully positive, but also potentially dangerous things in our lives. The stuff that makes us who we are is not to be trusted in and of itself. And it's when we have truly let it go and see it from a clearer perspective through the divine eyes that we can recognize its potency and our need to have it not in our hands but in God's hands. And it's in that spirit that God says, pick it up. And not just pick it up by the tail. I've never really handled anything but a garden snake. But I know how snakes act. And I know which end of the snake to pick up if I'm going to pick it up at all. It is not the tail, I'm here to say. But by this point in this particular dialogue, with things flipped around now, with that instruction given, Moses does what he's asked. And as soon as he touches it to pick it up, it becomes a staff again. But let me ask you the question, is that staff just the same? I mean, if a scientist were to take it into a lab and to test its cellular structure, they'd say yes. But you know and I know that it is now something utterly different in God's hands, in Moses' hands. This staff of Moses has become the staff of the living God. And Moses now, an instrument in God's hands as never before. This is a profound sort of spiritual transaction that can take place. There is an alchemy of the Spirit that takes place when the things that are just the stuff of our lives, mundane aspects of everyday existence, become through our spiritual seeing something utterly more because it's God's. And here we are, all of us, shining with Shekinah glory, if ready to yield our lives to God. The stuff of your Monday, the stuff of your Tuesday, the stuff of your Wednesday, the stuff of our collective life in God's hands can move the waters and take a nation through on dry ground, can lead a wandering people from captivity to freedom, can utterly change the world. And now it's not just about what we've got in our hands, but what God does with what's in our hands if yielded to God. It is striking to me that when I contemplate the life of Moses and what is about to ensue, his 40-year chapters, 2 of them out of the way, and at 80 years of age, the greatest of them all, just now beginning. And I think about it through the eyes of God's wisdom, with the benefit of historical retrospect. If I, who always through history operate through human beings, through people, want to move my people from captivity to the promised land and constitute them as a people who are organized around principles that endure, doesn't it make sense that I'm going to look for someone who has been tutored in the wisdom of a legal system, an orderly way of being the people? And doesn't it make sense that I'm going to look for someone who knows how to move across the very land I'm going to take this teeming mass of people to get from Egypt to the promised land? Am I not going to look for somebody who looks an awful lot like Moses, despite all of Moses' protestations? And how did he get there? His sin. Even his sin prepared him for this moment, to be where he was, ready for the next chapter of life. There is not one